What's up, y'all? Talon here. Today I'm going to be going over 10 picks that I have to do well at the Los Angeles Regionals. This is the regional happening this weekend, obviously in Los Angeles, California. There's a beautiful waterfall that I'm sure no one will actually see because they'll be all cramped up in the convention center hall the whole weekend. If you're lucky, if you get into Sunday, you're there the whole weekend. If not, you do have some time to sightsee. But yeah, going to be a very cool weekend in terms of meta progression. Actually, this is the so it's going to be this weekend. The next weekend is going to be a special event in Bologna, Italy, going to be a cool event for the Europeans, and then the North American International Championship will be the following weekend. So going to be a lot of fast and furious meta progression. So follow the channel if you want to get some insight into how the metagame is progressing on High Ladder. I do a lot of battles related to that, and I'm able to glean a little bit of what top players are thinking of planning to bring to events from those battles. Yeah, with all that being said, let's hop into some of the picks I have for this regional. And first we're going to go with the Pelipper. So Pelipper is an interesting pick. I'm not exactly sure how to feel about it because on one hand, it's actually won the last two regional events. It won the Latin American regional in Santiago, as well as the European regional in Stockholm, both with Zamazenta compositions. Zamazenta Pelippers rising up to be a very, very good team composition. I believe both body press or iron defense body press and wide guard won those two regionals. But yeah, Pelipper, aside from that, is actually seeing a decline in usage on teams that are not Zamazenta. I'm thinking mainly of Calyrex Ice, Calyrex Shadow. A lot of these teams are dropping the Urshifu Water or the Urshifu Surging Strike plus the Pelipper combination in favor of different Pokemon. And I feel like that is going to continue trending this weekend. So if you see a Pelipper, it's most likely going to be on a Zamazenta composition. We're definitely seeing a lot of centralization in the Rain teams in that respect. But yeah, generally on Pelipper, what you're going to be seeing is the Drizzle set. The Keen Eye is actually just obviously not very good. And then Wide Guard is the main utility if you weren't aware. Beyond just the ability to set up the Rain and boost up the Zamazenta's ability to tank Fire-type moves without having to burn a defensive Terra. It usually goes Terra Grass to handle opposing Amoonguss, and obviously that shares the Fire-type weakness, but if you're in the Rain, that is mitigated to some extent. But Wide Guard really shores up your weakness to Calyrex Shadow, which can otherwise go for really strong Astral Barrages, which would, if it has a boosting item to it, KO you, and you wouldn't be able to answer back that well. So having a Pelipper on the team provide Wide Guard support, if you are not Wide Guard yourself, is definitely very appreciated for Zamazenta. It's definitely present on the Calyrex teams that the Pelipper is shown to be on as well, but I do feel like we're going to see a lot more centralization of the Zamazenta Pelipper rather than the Pelipper plus the Calyrex Ice. And for that reason, I do actually think that Koraidon has a chance to shine this weekend. I think it's actually pretty well primed right now. It has a decent matchup into Zamazenta. If it's not the body press iron defense one, you can still just go for a Terra Fire and knock it out if you have advantage over the terrain. And one innovation that I have seen in the previous weeks is actually U-turn. So similar vein to the Volt Switch on its counterpart Koraidon, but U-turn's obviously not hitting for the stab option, but people's options for Koraidon are typically just to switch in a Pelipper, take away the Orichalcum Pulse Boost, and then basically wall your stabs out pretty well. You're still taking a lot of damage from them, but if it's a bulkier Rocky Helmet Pelipper, it definitely wins that 1v1 pretty well and also just stifles your offensive pressure on switch in. But if you have U-turn, you can kind of delay that, maybe pick off the Pelipper with the Pokemon, a lot of Ps there, that you switched into, or get in the Koraidon later in the game after Pelipper has gone down and go for a Terra Fire Flare Blitz, which should knock out even an Iron Defensed up Zamazenta if they've only gotten one Iron Defense up. With a Flare Blitz at 60%, I want to say that's the roll, if it's an Adamant Koraidon. And you can pretty easily get that with a fast Flutter Mane Moonblast, with a Thunderbolt from Raging Bolt in the Sun. These are all it's definitely very feasible to chip down the Zamazenta to that range and pivot to that end game. And it's so much easier to do that when you can U-turn out against Pelipper earlier in the battle and preserve your, basically win the Sun War that way. Beyond the innovation of U-turn, I do just feel like Raging Bolt, Flutter Mane are Pokemon that are still kind of undervalued in the metagame. People are noticing that Urshifu and Incineroar and Rillaboom aren't doing that well, but I feel like the takeaways from Regulation F of Raging Bolt and Flutter Mane still have a place in the meta. Definitely the Speed Booster one. For this case, it'll actually be Photosynthesis boosting. But yeah, Focus Sash, Speed Booster, Flutter Mane with Icy Wind, Moonblast, Taunt is very, very pesky for a lot of the hyper offensive teams in the metagame and can enable your Koraidon really well. And then Raging Bolt is just hitting so hard with Terra Electric, Photosynthesis boosted Thunderclaps with Terra Electric. And then Raging Bolt just has the capacity to hit very, very hard, even with an Assault Vet set in Sun with the Photosynthesis boost. Terra Electric, Thunderclap in Sun is just doing insane damage, chipping everything down. to a range where Koraidon can easily clean it up in the late games. And yeah, I just feel like enabling Fluttermane and Raging Bolt, along with the innovation of U-Turn, could make the Koraidon teams finally have the sauce they need to get a top placing in these tournaments. I do think the U-Turn innovation is something that's cool. It might not make its way on the top teams this week, but it's something I've definitely been keeping an eye on. I've also seen it with Gothitelle to some extent, but overall, I do think Koraidon has a lot of locked up potential that has not been unlocked prior to this weekend, and I think this one might be the weekend where it actually goes pretty deep. And speaking of Pokemon with locked up potential, let's go to Calyrex. I do feel like that Calyrex has been substantially underperforming relative to its strength in the format. It really just won that grassroots tournament with Wolfie's team and has been pretty quiet since then, as everyone has just very aggressively adapted with lots of Wide Guard on their team, lots of Terra Normals, Dark types, etc. to wall out your Astral Barrage and Psychic coverage. People have had to run Terra Fairy, Draining Kiss, which does so little damage if you're forced not to Astral Barrage. You can, yeah, if you get a couple nasty plots up, you can still do a lot of damage with Draining Kiss, but that's just so slow to get started, essentially. One set I've been seeing do well is actually Choice Specs on ladder. I've been seeing a lot of hyper offensive Choice Specs with Terra Ghost to just go immediately for an Astral Barrage. And the benefit of this is actually Terra Ghost Choice Specs is equivalent to, I believe, Terastallization is essentially boosting your stab moves by 1.33 compared to what they were before. That's just like 2 over 1.5, right? So what we see is actually you take the 1.5 multiplier from the Choice Specs, the 1.33 from the Terra Ghost, and you're actually hitting just as hard as a +2 Calyrex right off the rip with a Terra Ghost Choice Specs one, and that's just really threatening to have to deal with. If you pair it with something like a Mienshao that can feint, I actually have 3 Pokemon which I think pair very well with Calyrex that are being slept on right now. And I think some players are exploring it, but not a lot of people are aware of it. But yeah, the feint from something like a Mienshao is definitely very difficult to deal with. Wide Guard to support yourself defensively against other Calyrex. And overall, I feel like the Choice Spec set is definitely the way I would be running it right now, if not Life Orb or another offensive item. But overall, I do think the Terra Ghost Choice Spec set is how I would be running it right now, and I expect it to do pretty well this weekend, paired with a lot of definitely interesting fighting type choices with the Pawmot, Iron Valiant, and the Zamazenta, or not the Zamazenta, the Mienshao as options. But going more into detail in the Pawmot choice, it actually, it's not coming out of nowhere. It actually did very well at a Orlando Premier Challenge and Midseason Showdown. Don Check, he actually, I think, got top 16 in a Players Cup and a Players Cup 2. Yeah, did very well in the Sword and Shield era from my memory, but very hyper offensive team here. But the Pawmot is definitely the standout member. Fake Out, obviously very good utility, close combat, great against Terapagos, which would otherwise wall out your Psychic type moves or your Ghost type moves, and then Revival Blessing lets you play very aggressively early on with your Calyrex and the rest of your Pokemon, because you can always, if you get a read wrong, you get another chance with Revival Blessing. After you've maybe chipped down the threats earlier in the battle, if something can take 1 Astral Barrage, that's cool, I guess, but can it take 2 is the question. That's the proposition that Pawmot is posing to you. And it's just very difficult to deal with, and I think it's something not a lot of players are prepared for and could catch some people off guard. Next Pokemon that pairs pretty well with Calyrex is actually Booster Energy Iron Valiant. And I was actually joking about this when I tweeted it, but Pokemon Showdown went down a little while ago, and I tweeted this out that PS withdrawals are causing rampant unchecked theory modding, and I'm seeing team building chats put Iron Valiant in the builder at an unprecedented rate. I wasn't actually seeing any Iron Valiant in the builder, but it appears that it's definitely been popping up a lot on High Ladder, this Booster Energy set with, I think I've seen Taunt, Wide Guard, I've seen Icy Wind, I've seen a lot of different options, and then you can have things like Moonblast if you want, you can go Spirit Break, and also Close Combat. These are all great coverage moves. You can kind of pick whatever you want with Iron Valiant. It has 4 move slot syndrome in that respect, but generally Wide Guard is going to pretty much always be there. It's just such a great move in this metagame, blocking all the spread type move, restricted Pokemon's offensive output very significantly. Taunt is really good against something like a Mungus, which could, or really just Trick Room teams in general, being able to taunt a Mungus or taunt a Trick Room Pokemon like Farigiraf, which could otherwise wall your Calyrex Shadows, Astral Barrages, and then set up Trick Room and make things really difficult for you. Having the option to taunt that and just not even have to worry about knocking it out that turn is really cool. And then an Icy Wind means you're able to basically outspeed something that would otherwise outspeed your Calyrex, Icy Wind it, knock it out. Or if you're in a mirror and you don't really want to be hitting Wide Guard against another Calyrex, you can Icy Wind it first and then get the knockout with your own Astral Barrage that way. The last Pokemon I want to touch on is the Mienshao. I already briefly covered it, but essentially the Fake Out Feint Mind Game turn 1 is really difficult to deal with when you're faced with a immediate +2 Calyrex effectively with the Terra Ghost Choice Specs. Astral Barrage, like If you whiff that turn, you can either get fainted on your protect, you're getting 2 at KO'd at that point, and you got nothing out of that turn, or you get fake outed and it's just the same situation. You kind of have to play that mind game. It's very difficult to lead against the Mienshao Calyrex combination for certain teams and play it safely. You kind of just have to get the calls right. And more often than not, the Calyrex Mienshao player is more experienced. They might know what a player using your archetype is more conditioned to do or is more likely to do just through sheer repetition, whereas you don't have those reps. And then Wide Guard is just excellent coverage, similar for the Iron Valiant, and then close combat, awesome into Terapagos, which again is going to be walling out your ghost type moves on that Pokemon. One last thing before we move on, I want to touch on the ability of the Calyrex Shadow with the choice specs to actually run coverage moves, which is more important than you would think. So typically the set is Protect, Nasty Plot, and you typically see Draining Kiss. You could go for Expanding Force as well. But the problem with these sets is they are all kind of walled by a couple of things. Like, you really wish you had just a big combination of moves to switch in and go for a move that is best in a certain situation. Shadow Ball in the case of a bulky Wide Guard user. Psychic also similarly very good, but if they have a defensive Terra against your Psychic type moves, not very good in that situation. Pollen Puff, good against things like for Rigraff. But yeah, just having these options to hit things for single target and like basically read them to go for Wide Guard because they have to in front of your choice specs, and then hit them with a single target move and just knock them out is very cool and something that not a lot of other Calyrex are able to do. And I think definitely differentiates it in terms of game plans for a lot of teams facing up against it. And then I would of course be remiss to not mention Zamazenta. I do feel like Zamazenta is going to continue having good finishes. Both the Iron Defense and the Wide Guard sets have won regionals at this point. You kind of have to prepare for both. Both of them typically have Pelipper. It's a very strong composition, and I think its matchup spread into Terapagos, which has gotten second at the 2 largest tournaments of the year, both Stockholm and Indianapolis. Definitely is really important. The Terragrass set does decent against Koraidon. I can at least resist the Volt switches and force them to like make a read on Draco, which can definitely be very appreciated. But overall, I do feel like the Zamazenta, its matchup spread is excellent at this point in the metagame. Beats Calyrex Ice pretty hard, beats Terapagos pretty well, and those are really the 2 biggest things. It's not that great in the Calyrex Shadow if you're running Iron Defense, but a lot of them are running Wide Guard. So I think this is the most neutral, restricted in the format right now, and a lot of top players are realizing this and capitalizing on it. So looking for another strong finish from Zamazenta. Speaking of strong finishes, I want to touch on the Ogerpon and the Chi-Yu, aka Focus Sash, the Pokemon on Ogerpon, and Focus Sash, the best user on the Chi-Yu. Whimsicott also a very good user of it, but I think, yeah, we'll start with the Ogerpon. So I think we're still really undervaluing Follow Me plus Sturdy in a metagame like this. Basically any of the support Pokemon, they don't have great spread moves, Raging Bolts, Incineroar, Rillaboom, etc. Having the option to Follow Me your something like a Goldango against a Incineroar is very valuable. I've seen a kind of rising combination of Raging Bolts, Ogerpon, and set up Goldango with Ogerpon-Cornerstone Mask, and I think it's definitely pretty slept on. But just the general utility of Follow Me plus Sturdy is really hard for teams to deal with. Just guaranteed being able to switch in safely, at least for 1 turn, and then get an attack off is valuable. Ivy Cudgel is pretty unresisted coverage. There's not a ton of steel types outside of Zamazenta in the metagame, and usually the Ogerpon is actually paired with something that can hit that Zamazenta pretty hard. It's his really weakest matchup in the metagame outside of that. Ogerpon is really well poised. And Ogerpon also pairs well against opposing Chi-Yu, but Chi-Yu a common partner for the Ogerpon. Very similar principle here. Essentially, the Focus Sash means you can at least trade a hit, and if that hits a Beads of Ruin Overheat, you're pretty happy about that a lot of the time. Also being able to Heat Wave. Many Pokemon in this metagame are kind of mid-speed tier or very fast, so Chi-Yu will outspeed pretty much everything in those lower speed tiers, be able to hit it with a Dark Pulse, a Snarl, a Heat Wave, and Overheat, and potentially knock them out before they can move. Switch out, come into the battle later, either with the Focus Sash intact or broken, but still, you know, a 1 HP Chi-Yu is still a Chi-Yu and alive, and if you outspeed the rest of your opponent's team, you're just taking a knockout and they can't answer it. So I do think Chi-Yu is going to have another strong weekend. Usually on Tailwind teams, I would definitely say Whimsicott, Torn, Chi-Yu, going to continue to be very good. And a Pokemon that is almost always there is also the Terapagos. And the reason I have Choice Specs and Calm Mind here is actually Choice Specs has gotten finals of the last 2 tournaments very narrowly, losing out Andrew Zhang and I believe it was Joji Kaida. Got 2nd place with the Choice Spec set with the Terrastellar Hyper Beam on both of them. Very deadly set, but Calm Mind actually just got top 4. I went 8-0 in Santiago Regionals, so really big performance with it. And you might have noticed I've actually said 10 Pokemon at this point. Volcarona is going to be my bonus 11th because it actually did go 8-0 in Santiago. And I think it's a Pokemon that does very well into Zamazenta, does well into Chien-Pao. It has some pretty good matchup spreads in the meta right now that we're not really paying attention to, so I could see some innovative builders look at Santiago and say, okay, I feel like Volcarona still being slept on, let's go into this regional and take advantage of that. But going back, I think Calm Mind Terapagos could do well. I'm really not a fan of it. I think the Choice Spec set is a lot more proactive, and the Calm Mind set is a little too passive in a metagame like this where you really need to be taking full advantage of your turns. I don't think the Calm Mind set is perfectly suited for this metagame in particular, but it definitely had a great showing at Santiago. Could actually have a chance to go deep in a larger tournament this time around. That's going to do it for my overview of the Latin American top picks for this event. I think as a quick summary for the restricteds, I think Koraidon could definitely have a hot event. Choice Specs Calyrex with its motley crew of dumpster Exodia Pokemon could have its day in the sun. Zamazenta going to continue to be the most neutral restricted Pokemon that a lot of top players are able to do well with, kind of just player difference with. And then Terapagos, I believe, has a chance to go pretty deep once again, maybe not second place. I think people, basically with the Zamazenta usage rising, it might be a little bit harder since that matchup is so negative. The Calm Mind set could have a chance to shine this time. I doubt it, but I'll feature it here just in case, essentially. And overall, yeah, that's going to be my summary of my picks for the Los Angeles Regionals. If you enjoy these type of videos, please let me know in the comments below. And yeah, with all that being said, peace, y'all.